Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Market Forces versus Regulation, How to Drive IT Product Safety. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Before we begin and introduce our speakers, I did want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording today's session, and we will be sending out a link to the recording as well as the slides in the next day or so. If you do have any questions, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A, and we will save a little time at the end of the session to address questions. Not sure if we'll take the full hour, but we have allowed for it. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. I am joined today by Alan Alford, who is our CISO here at Eclipsium. And joining him is Tyson Supasadet, who is our Director of Product Marketing. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Tyson.
Thank you, Melissa. Very excited about this topic. We're seeing a lot of movement in this area. I think a lot of demand. So today we're going to be defining the problem of IT product safety. We're going to be discussing the various approaches from the EU, the US, and from industry groups. We're going to look at examples from highway safety and aviation safety. We're going to be talking about vendor risk management and what needs to change there. And then we're going to talk about a new market category for supply chain intelligence. So just to start it off, Alan, are our IT products safe? You might have had some experiences about this recently.
Yeah, there's been a lot of stuff over the last, I've been in IT almost 30 years. I've been in cybersecurity probably 25 of that, and we've seen a steady increase, a steady progression. All the way back then, we saw things like bootleg Cisco switch cards making it into the supply chain, and going even to like Navy intelligence and some other critical government folks getting these bootleg cards. That was 20 years ago. Now it's just out of control. The rate and amount, Citrix NetScaler, Avanti, Intel. I mean, we're seeing stuff all over the place, gigabyte motherboards, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing vulnerabilities in the IT supply chain to a far greater extent than we've ever seen them before. And it looks like it's just steadily growing and not shrinking. I don't think it goes anywhere other than worse from here.
Yeah, and at the same time, while the complexity of these IT products and security has arguably, become a more difficult problem, they're more crucial to business and society with digital transformation. Everybody, local governments, hospitals, everybody's colonial pipeline, everybody's reliant on these IT products.
Yeah, it's ubiquitous now. I don't think anybody anywhere on the planet can do much of anything without some device or another plugged into some network somewhere. And so it's definitely a real issue.
Okay. So I just wanted to put this out there. Earlier this year, we published a blog post with a very lengthy infographic, just charting out all the different threats against network devices that we've seen. And the reason we did this is just to show that the scale and sophistication of these types of attacks that are targeting network devices are really ramping up. Last year, we saw a lot of activity, not just from the nation state groups like Volt Typhoon and Black Tech, but we also saw a lot of activity from ransomware groups like Akira and Lockbit. They were going after Citrix, multiple Citrix 0 days, Cisco 0 days, Fortinet exploits. And then earlier at the beginning of this year, it didn't stop. We saw just the disclosures of these multiple Avanti 0 days, and then the problems associated with that. So it's just to give you the audience an idea of, yes, IT product safety is definitely a problem. When we think about when you take a product and you deploy it, what you see in orange, the customers are responsible for this. You being able to manage and patch vulnerabilities. Sometimes those get exploited. Sometimes they're 0 days, sometimes they're not. And then you discover the intrusion, and then you have to go into the very costly incident response process, and that may involve, getting the regulators, like now the SEC, involved, and all of that. But with the idea of shift left, what can we do to lessen the severity or frequency of these types of incidents further left in the life cycle? So now we're talking about product development, and could potentially out of the hands of the customer unless there's market forces or regulation. So anything to add on this slide, Alan?
No, this is exactly it. You want to be left of boom, and the problem is from the moment that vulnerability is exposed to the moment it's discovered can be a very short amount of time. Like this most recent one, XV, it was found thankfully very, very quickly, by sheer chance and coincidence, but found very quickly. Or it could be something that's been lurking for a long, long, long time, and who knows how long the bad guys have been exploiting it before it was discovered. So clearly what we can control is only so much, and we definitely get into the product manufacturers having to do something, or some third party intercessor, to your point, involving themselves in the product manufacturing. You've got to have some kind of pressure, some kind of force at that moment of creation to ensure the best integrity possible,
Yeah, exactly.
or
And
validate the integrity, right?
yeah. um so you and I were talking about this small table, just talking about the different approaches from the EU, which tends to be more regulatory, and then the US, which tends to try to influence the market. And then there's good things coming out of the industry. Maybe Alan, can I ask you to talk about some of the points here that you're especially interested in?
Yeah, so the Cyber Resilience Act is very interesting to me. The best analogy I've come up with so far, and it's a little bit not accurate, but let's call it the GDPR of cybersecurity for products, right? Like it's the same sort of spirit and same sort of intent as GDPR. It is meant to cover the EU. It is meant to protect the citizens of the EU. It's sort of targeted towards the folks that might be the victims of bad security. The way they're doing it is, if you want to sell into the EU, you have to get the CE label. So in that case, it's kind of like Energy Star or one of these other ones where you have to prove you're doing the thing to get your sticker, and then only if you have your sticker can you sell. So it's a little bit different than Energy Star there. Energy Star is only mandated in certain places, not everywhere. But this one will be mandated across the EU. So think of an Energy Star meets a GDPR, and there you have it, regulatory. It's not in effect yet. It's coming soon to a theater near you. But that's a big deal. That's a really big deal that's coming, and it's going to radically change all these devices and all these manufacturers. I mean, we're talking like I'm sitting here in a podcast booth with one, two, three, four, five, six devices that have firmware in them, that have BIOSes in them, that have chips in them, that ultimately would need that CE label of some sort to be sold in the EU. And this is just my podcast booth. If I went through my entire home, that would probably be hundreds of devices. So this
Yeah.
is going to be a really big deal. And per the EU, per the GDPR precedent, this is very much a regulatory driven thing. They are convinced over in Europe that regulation is the way to drive change, culturally and historically. This is how they do it. Um, they've got in the enterprise that Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA, which is a third party risk management and oversight. And again, management and oversight is key phrase there. That's for the enterprise side, versus the Cyber Resilience Act is more aimed to protect the citizens, the consumers. But it's the same story. It's regulatory. And then in US, we tend to go with let the market do its thing. And so you see executive orders that come out. You see things like, executive orders coming out of the White House. You do see legislation on occasion, but there's an awful lot of stuff where it's just let's design it, let's recommend, let's let the market take off and do its thing. So CISA, NIST, CSF, and these sorts of things aren't mandated. It's just good guidance, and the trust is that the market is going to do the thing. Now, if cybersecurity is to be a differentiator in the market, this works. This model is very effective. Unfortunately, there are some spaces and places, especially when you talk about the consumer end of it, where having the cyber trust mark, are consumers really looking for that? Are consumers, are they savvy enough to know this matters and should matter? We are in a culture now of people that are internet connecting their refrigerators, their toasters, and their light bulbs, and I don't know how many folks are truly thinking about the security implications therein. I recorded an episode of my podcast a little while back with Chris Roberts, and the entire episode was all about how these internet connected, multicolor hue light bulbs were being leveraged as literally spy devices, that they had figured out a way to measure the vibrations on the glass, leveraging the technology that was built in, transmit that stuff down the wire, suddenly surveillance devices by way of your light bulb. Like, this stuff
Is
is
that
real.
for
This stuff is
real? What?
scary. Yeah. Yeah. And, that's just one of many, many, many examples. Your internet connected refrigerator, who knows what's going on with it, right? um, in the video conferencing industry, I know for a fact that way back when, even we talked about how these issues are growing and becoming worse over time. I remember a time way back when certain video conferencing appliance that was very ubiquitous, that the manufacturer told everybody, don't plug directly into the internet, put it behind a firewall. And of course, consumers not necessarily being cyber savvy, there were tons and tons of them plugged into the internet. You could go to Shodan and see a bazillion of them, and they became part of a botnet. They had a chip inside them that was the same chip, weirdly enough, in a consumer router firewall device. And there was a botnet attack that was looking for those devices and inserting code, and happened to find these video conferencing devices. The chip was there, it was exposed, it responded to the check. So they became part of the botnet as well. This stuff is going on everywhere, and consumers have to be more savvy. So it's great that we have some executive orders that are starting to drive. I mean, I'm a Texan, if you can't tell by my background, and Texans generally are not pro regulation. But sometimes in this space, it feels like we've got to have some authoritative body pounding the table and saying, thou shalt, because there's just so much, I don't know what to call it, oblivion on the part of the consumers, enterprise and consumer both, that we've got to get more savvy. We've got to start asking for more. We've got to start making cybersecurity be a differentiator in the marketplace. And we do that through things like what the industry's doing here. We got SBOMs. We got the Eclipse Foundation CRA working group. That's a voluntary participation group put together by a bunch of telecom folks that got together and said, you know what, if we combine forces and make a consortium and start speaking to these issues, we can start getting more resilience and more cyber savvy and all this kind of good stuff. So we're seeing pockets of it here and there, but at the end of the day, I'm not quite sure that market forces are working, because at the end of the day, I'm not sure the consumer is savvy enough and caring enough to go for the market force approach, right?
Yeah, I actually am going to disagree a little bit. I think consumers do worry, but they just don't know who to trust or who to listen to. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of rumors around, oh, public Wi-Fi is not safe, or if you plug in your USB to charge your device, you're going to get hacked. There's a lot of like kind of myths out there,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
then people are telling them, well, actually, and at that point, people's just eyes glaze over because they don't know,
Right.
who to believe. But yeah, if we can start to get some labeling programs, possibly, I actually think people will care, hopefully. But
Yeah.
the question I would ask, because our topic is not so much about consumers, but do enterprises care?
Yeah.
You
Enterprises
know,
care more than consumers by far. Always have
but
and
but
always will.
but
They've got
are
more
are
at
we?
stake.
But are we? I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves. But like, are we making our purchasing decisions based on based on IT product safety?
Yeah. So sometimes yes and sometimes no. I think to your point, sometimes it's not that the consumer is oblivious, it's that the consumer doesn't know how to do anything about the concerns they have. So there's a general sense of unease that they don't know how to exercise or what to do, what the next step is to resolve that unease. I think in the enterprise, people are more savvy. I think they're more aware of what the issues are. I think they're more aware that they can do things. Supply chain security is a phrase we all know and love, or know and loathe, pick one. And it's real, it's there, but are we doing enough, and is it enough, is it sufficient, is a whole nother question.
Yeah, good points. Yeah. Yeah, you brought up the Network Resilience Coalition is I think it's Fortinet, Cisco, AT&T. There's like a dozen groups. They got together last year,
Yep.
and then earlier this year they put out a white paper. And in their white paper, they had recommendations for manufacturers. They said, you should align with the NIST SSDF. You need to provide more details to your customers around end of life and what that means. And then you need to separate your security fixes from your your product updates, because especially for things like network devices, where it's touching like production systems,
Mhm.
you just want to be able to apply the security patch and not worry about breaking stuff. Um, and then they had information around some open EOX standard for end of life information. I don't honestly
Mhm.
don't know much about that. But then the buyers, is kind of the flip side. They said, hey, you should be looking at who's following SSDF. Ask for that type of
Mhm.
self attestation during the procurement process, and then favor those vendors. And then they had the normal stuff around vulnerability management and configuration. But it's a start. Like you said, you got to start somewhere. At least they're paying attention to this.
Yeah.
I wanted to switch over to the other industries, so automobiles, aviation, and here what we have is the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration has been collecting all kinds of information on traffic fatalities and what circumstances, what models of cars. So what we've seen over the last 50 years is that as Americans, or speaking as an American, and that NHTSA is an American organization, but over the last 50 years, we've driven millions or more miles, but the fatalities per million miles drive has consistently gone down, and
Mhm.
that's good. It's and we here the NTSB puts together similar things for aviation, so you can go see and see there's data out there, and what it comes to is really a mix of market forces and industry regulation
Mhm.
is helping to
Mhm.
uh, drive those numbers down.
Yep. Anti-lock brakes were invented by a manufacturer and later mandated by regulation, right? They came along, they were a feature originally. Hey, we got this cool thing, your car won't skid. Ooh, said the consumers, they got interested, they bought. Eventually, it's now law that all cars have anti-lock brakes, right? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the three-point safety belt, this is my favorite story in this space of all time because it's this beautiful fusion of all these concepts we're talking about. So Volvo invented the three-point safety belt back in the day. They patented it. They then turned around and went to the entire automotive manufacturing community, global automotive manufacturing community, and said, even though we have the patent on this, we're not going to enforce it. We want everyone to include three-point safety belts in their cars. This is in Europe, where, as we pointed out, regulation tends to reign. And yet, here was a market initiative, a voluntary market initiative. They could have made a ton of money and exploited this and been, we're the only safe car, and we got the three-point safety belt. We patented it, and nobody else has it. And they gave it away for free to better life and safety for all earthlings, right? Like literally gave it to the world. Um, it's a beautiful moment. And it's a moment that ought to be reflected more in these IT things. And I can speak to one in my own personal experience back when Heartbleed came out. And we should all know Heartbleed, especially given that we've had a recent similar event. Um, we had a bunch of products that were end of life and end of support and all of that stuff. And then Heartbleed hit. And I went as the head of product security. I went all the way up to the CEO and said, I don't care if it's end of life or not. We can't leave this vulnerability out there for these customers, even if they're ancient customers who haven't renewed, re-upped, or repurchased. I want to fix it going far back in time. And I got buy-in, and the CEO agreed. And as a company, we chose to patch Heartbleed even for our end-of-life products. It's that same kind of story. This is an example of someone in the marketplace doing something altruistic, right? Like the theory goes that the market forces are always just these vicious, capitalist war grounds. And yet you look at Volvo, you look at the company I worked at back then, you see these moments where the right thing happens for the whole community, even though it is driven by a market.
Alan, we didn't discuss this earlier because it just came to me, but would you say like large tech companies that are using open source components in their applications or devices, having like official support for those open source projects, could that be like an example of a 3-point safety belt?
Yeah, it's interesting when you get into the intersection of open source and commercial manufacturing, because there's rules and regs and the licenses and et cetera about what you can and can't do, and how you have to include or open source code yourself, and all these, sort of these sticky licenses, if you will, viral licenses. But at the end of the day, if the vulnerability comes from the open source realm and your product incorporates that open source code, as far as I'm concerned, you are just as beholden, if not more so, than if you generated that vulnerability yourself with your own code. In other words, something like Heartbleed comes out. The very first thing I had to do as the head of product security was to go through my entire product suite. And I mean, every single product we manufacture, there were hundreds of them. And we had to figure out, is Heartbleed contained therein? And so the
Mhm.
first thing I had to do was release a press release and get it out on the support channels and get it to all my customers who were calling and get it to the support lines, every place that a customer might interface. And we had to put out, this product has it, this one does not, this one has it, this one does not, and start with that list. So we were, as far as I was concerned, 100% responsible for that. And then the next step was, of course, for the ones that do have it, what's our remediation path and plan? And of course, Heartbleed was one. Again, it wasn't our problem. We didn't create the Heartbleed problem. This was disclosed to the world overnight. Everyone was panicking. Everyone was freaking out. We didn't know when the fix was coming or what the fix would be. But I still took total ownership as we went through that whole process and that whole journey. And I think that's how it should work.
Mhm. I was sort of thinking, like, I mean, the world really depends at this point. We depend on open source projects,
Oh,
and
absolutely, we do.
like in the case of this XZ, utility, um, it was just one guy who was kind of overloaded,
Yeah,
right? And then somebody came along and said, "Hey, I'm going to help you out," you know.
right. Lots of help.
So, so yeah, help. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, I don't know if the tech companies, our own included, if we're doing enough to help maintain these projects and provide funding for
Yeah,
support.
it gets really interesting. The open source software community is, I don't want to say governed, but there are alliances and there are groups like the Open Source Software Foundation, and the Linux Foundation and these sorts of things. You've got dedicated maintainers and you've got contributors, and there's a bit of a hierarchy and a bit of authority to what's going on. But at the end of the day, OpenSSF can't, slam their fist on the table and do a regulatory move that forces everyone to do X, Y, and Z.
Mhm.
The open source community, by definition, tends to be sort of some techno anarchist type folks that are rabidly about giving their stuff away for free. And even if a corporation came and offered money and said, "Hey, we use your project religiously in our products. We'd love to give you some extra money to help bolster it, get a security engineer on staff, et cetera, et cetera." These guys will more likely than not refuse that corporate money because they don't want to be perceived as having been somehow sucked into, corporate land, sold out
Yeah,
to the man, this sort of thing.
yeah.
Um, and that's a real challenge. That's a real challenge. So it becomes something that, excuse me, big picture view, there's alternatives and possibilities there. There's big stuff that could be done, and I don't want to speak for what the open source community is planning, doing, working on, et cetera, because that's a whole nother. We could do a 3 hour
Yeah.
show on that. But
Mhm.
as to that intersection with the corporate responsibility, I mean, at the end of the day, it's important that any corporation that incorporates open source code inspect that code as well as they can, and take ownership when inherited stuff happens, per the example we gave, and does their best to put forth the best version of that code, mediate the mitigate, all the things you can possibly do. A lot of times a CVE will hit the streets and it's a big severity 10 sort of scenario, and at the end of the day you go to your particular manufacturer that has disclosed, yes indeed we're using, let's keep using Heartbleed as an example. Yes, we have the Heartbleed vulnerability in our whatever, our router. um but it's mitigated because it's not exposed to the external world, and we've got these other compensating controls and these other kinds of things. Like, those kinds of statements and analyses need to be provided by manufacturers, but at the end of the day, no one manufacturer is truly on top of what they've got. You
Mhm.
need a third party validator of some kind to come along and analyze and say, hey, there is a Heartbleed that's exposed, or hey, it may be in there but we can't find it from the outside. That third party validation almost becomes a must. There's this there's this story behind open source. Like when open source first came out, the cybersecurity world was like, oh my God, we can't trust this dirty code that who knows who is producing and God only knows what's in it. Open source was anathema to the security community back when.
Hmm.
And the mindset shifted. And then the mindset became, hey, open source is actually potentially more secure than closed source because you've got so many eyes on it.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great story. So many eyes on it, and that's a true possibility. Any pair of eyes on planet Earth can go into open source and review the code, but are they incentivized to do so? Right. And
Mhm.
so this is where again a third party intercessor, mediator, evaluator, whatever you want to call it, is probably the smartest solution because even the corporations that are leveraging this code, is it in their interest to have a dedicated engineer whose sole job is to sift through all of this stuff, trying to find that needle in the haystack and try to find that one vulnerability? The odds are they're not going to make that investment. And everyone is sort of, it's the tragedy of the commons. Everyone is relying on everyone else to do the good thing. And therefore nobody's doing the good thing. So
Yeah.
so this idea that all eyes are on the code, maybe not really happening.
I'd love to. Yeah, it's a good topic, and maybe we can find the right experts to bring on. This is anyways, I just brought it up because the 3-point safety belt
Yeah.
analogy, but I think what I was what we saw is that Volvo, they made their product safety a competitive differentiator,
Hmm. They absolutely
and
did.
they said they started going to consumers and educating consumers on about product design and crumple sections and things like that.
Yep.
And then you could argue, okay, they're not like the top three, but they're pretty good for a Swedish car company, I think.
Yeah. And let's be honest, back in those days, Volvos were ugly cars. Everybody else was focused on styling and curves and wings and all these things they were doing with their cars. And Volvo put out these boxy things that just weren't, they just weren't good looking cars. And yet they were still selling the heck out of them. And it was because of this safety differentiator. That is absolutely how they made their name. So it's proof that market forces can do this. Again, with consumer awareness, this ad itself represents, consumer education, if you will. It's
Mhm.
not just an ad. It's like, hey, you want to be safe, check out all these cool features we have, and we've been doing this forever. Love Volvo. There's a certain amount of education responsibility on the manufacturer if you're going to get a consumer base to really embrace security as a differentiator. But this is exactly what Volvo did and did successfully. So we know it's doable.
Yeah, we were talking about the data being available to the consumer. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration not only collects that data, but they also come up with crash test ratings
Hmm.
that you can go to their website and you can input different models of cars and see how they line up for like forward crash or side crash or all of these things. So, but there's not anything like this for the IT industry. You can't. There's not anything that like crash test ratings for software applications or crash test ratings for firewalls or network routers or things like that.
Yeah.
It's not. It doesn't really exist. Which is kind of like a gap, right?
Yeah.
It's a gap in the vendor risk management process.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This is, this slide speaks to what we do today, right? What do we do? External cybersecurity assessments. Think of the credit score type entities and companies. We're gonna register with such and such company who's gonna sniff you from the outside, give you a score and rating, and I can call you and harass you that your web server is X and your DNS is Y, and you've got a score of a C minus, and tidy up your shop. The flaw with this model is it's all open source intelligence. It's what can be seen from the outside. It's what can be scraped from the outside. It's not necessarily indicative of what's going on inside. It's not indicative of what's going on with the products. The product security team and the IT security team are usually divorced from one another in most manufacturing companies. It's just the truth. And oftentimes there's inaccuracies, this open source intelligence. I worked at one company that I used to be on the uh, security side of the house. I was the respondent to the questionnaires around this stuff. And I can't tell you how many times I had to waste my time going through and saying, not even us, not even us, not even us, company we sold, not even us, company I've never even heard of, not even us, not even us. And then I'd have to respond back to somebody who hit me with one of these, scorecard reports. And I'd be like, 90% of what you sent me isn't even me. And the remaining 10%, I've got a WAF, I've got CDN, I've got all these things in between me and you that could be reporting false positives. You're acting like you're seeing this port open for some database I don't have and have never heard of, et cetera, et cetera. So the accuracy of these things is suspect. The relevance of these things is suspect, not the best solution. So then we fall back on the good old security questionnaire, SIG Lite, proprietary questionnaires, whatever you might be using. There's a million and one shops that there's companies out there that offer to be sort of your questionnaire face, if you will. Companies who will put the questionnaire forward and the customer has to answer them and store them in the database and blah blah blah. It doesn't matter how you do this. If you're doing it with Excel, if you're doing it with one of these online resources, at the end of the day, I like to believe that people aren't going to outright lie, right? Like I like to believe people are honest and intentional, especially in the corporate world where lawsuits are a possibility. People are honest, and this is market forces keeping people honest. We're not even talking about regulation here.
Mhm.
But that doesn't say that they're not putting their best foot forward. You
Yeah.
could have a highly specific question that they interpret one way, you were intending it another way. They answer with a yes, you're satisfied and walk away with a yes, but it wasn't the yes you were looking for actually. It was a different interpretation that produced that yes. This kind of thing is endemic, systemic, pandemic, whatever all the demics you want to call it with security questionnaires. It's just how they operate. So I, it's tough. It's tough. Supply chain security is really tough. And there's some new entities that are out there that are doing some clearinghouse type activity. You can get your SOC 2 attestations and you can get your ISO certifications and you can get your FIPS validations and all these kinds of things and centrally store them along with the answers to your questionnaires. There's been some effort to improve security questionnaire and of course all the certs and validations have always been there as well. But again, they're not necessarily proof. ISO 27001, I can sit there and select the confined domain of where the ISO audit takes place, and I can restrict it down so small that it's not even meaningful. Or it can be working on the enterprise, not the products, or the products, not the enterprise, or et cetera, et cetera. Like even all these certifications, validations, attestations, there's wiggle room that can render them sort of null and void for the real purpose of, hey, are these products I'm buying secure or not? That's the real question, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I want to know when I deploy this thing in my podcast booth, is that going to be how I get hacked? That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, as the CISO at Eclipsium, Alan, are you, thinking about, asking our our vendors for SSDF attestation or SBOMs or this type of thing?
I'm absolutely doing that. I am, um, I'm looking as a consumer CISO, in other words, we'll call it. I am the one who is very much looking at everybody we buy, everybody we do business with, I'm grilling them. At the same time, I am a vendor and I'm being grilled by everyone I'm doing business with. I get to live on both sides of that equation. And I always have. I've been a vendor CISO more times than I've not been a vendor CISO. Almost every company I've worked for has manufactured some sort of technology device. I've been in telecom, I've been in manufacturing, I've been in the cybersecurity industry itself, like I am now. So I've always lived on both sides of that fence, and it's really fascinating. The best option I've seen in terms of the real world is, you know, going through and saying, just get the other CISO on the line. Let's have a CISO to CISO talk, and let's talk about what's real and what really concerns us.
Mhm.
And that helps to shortcut the problems we outlined on these slides, right? It absolutely helps to shortcut those. But it doesn't it doesn't necessarily uh solve everything.
Yeah.
It's 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 more than just these conversations, and that's going bi-directionally, right? I'm speaking from both sides of this house. What we really have to do is we have to get into the product itself, because again, you can convince me as the CISO that you got your act together, that you're on top of these things, you've got a good risk register, you've got a real management program, You've got a maturity assessment. You've got, a framework compliance that you're actively working on. You've got other audits and things that are working for you. There's all these ways to say that and do that, and that's great, and that helps a lot. That helps ease my pain a lot as the CISO. That being said, um, you know, I still want to know about the products too, and it's hard to know even from that CISO conversation what's taking place in the products. And again, we fall back on a
Yeah.
third party intercessor, mediator, evaluator, reporter, etc. Goes a long way for that. At the end of the day, are you gonna take the chef's word that his restaurant is awesome, or are you gonna go read all the reviews of his restaurant and see if it's really awesome or not? It's that same kind of story.
Yeah. And you know, we when the not to pick on Avanti because they're you know they're the ones that got hit, but it might be endemic, in the space. So, our director of threat research, Nate Warfield, he dug into their firmware OS, and he found, wow, they're using, 11-year-old, versions of Linux or
Yeah,
things like that, and you kind of want to have that type of transparency and that type
yeah.
of understanding of like what's in the actual IT product. Recently, we saw their CEO come out with a statement, vowing to,
We're gonna
rehaul
overhaul.
security. Yeah, and that's very welcome. I think
Yep.
it was the right thing to do, right?
And this is a great example because Ivanti has been the how do I want to put it? It's been the hot potato product for years now. Ivanti has been owned by Ivanti is the current owner of Pulse Secure, right?
Right.
Which was owned by Juniper, which was also owned by a PE firm, which was also owned by et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
When a product is sold and sold and sold and sold and sold,
Hmm.
inevitably the new inheritor doesn't even know the full guts of what they have.
Hmm.
That's part of the problem. Part of the problem is, it ain't broke, don't fix it. Part of the problem is I'm scared to fix it because I don't know what I'm going to break. There's a million and one reasons when a product gets sold and sold and sold and sold to let it keep riding. And so I could, as the CISO, meet with the Avanti CISO, for example. I don't even know who that is, but let's follow the analogy. And we have a great conversation. And I feel like, oh man, you got a great program over there. You got a product security team. You got an AppSec team. You got a risk management, all the things I'm looking for. Yay for you. You're a great CISO. And yet the product is still a problem because the product is inherited. And
Yeah.
that's just a reality. Even that CISO to CISO paradigm I mentioned, like I may get a perfectly good feeling after that conversation and still have an insecure product.
Yeah. So, what types of questions would you want? And here, what we're getting at is like, there's a need for supply chain intelligence,
Hmm.
that can, I guess, answer these types of questions.
Yeah.
And, you want to know like, hey, I acquired, a company, and, they have a bunch of, um, this type of product, like what's the risk, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Let's imagine that I start as the CISO who walks in the door on a brand new company, and I'm even the CISO slash CIO. Let's imagine I've got all that control and capability, and I'm walking in the door with, right now it's me and the CEO, and we each have our laptops, and I get to grow and develop and design as the company grows and develops and designs. I get to do that for the IT infrastructure. So flash forward 3 years, and we're now booming with 1,000 employees, and I've got total control and total knowledge of everything in my shop because I was lucky enough to be there at day zero, et cetera, et cetera. Even in that scenario, which of course is not realistic at all, but let's imagine it's a realistic scenario. Other things are going to happen. There's going to be an M&A story. There's going to be a notice that comes out that, yeah, even though you thought this particular brand of notebook you had and been using all these years was super secure, there's a known vulnerability. I'm going to M&A a company who's using completely different stuff. Um, I am going to, you know, inherit employees. I'm going to be told work from home is now a thing. I'm going to be told that, we're aging out this fleet of gear and we're contemplating switching brands since we are going to age it out. Let's go ahead and look at what the market has now. Back 10 years ago when we bought it, this was the reigning king. Maybe somebody else is better now. there's a million and one change stories there. Even if you have total control and have been there from day one, controlling every single detail, there's still a million and one change stories. And so the questions I have to ask are, okay, I'm looking at buying product A versus product B, company A versus company B. What the heck's the real story for security out there? I can Google around and try to find things, and I can search the CVE database, and there's stuff I can do to try to get a feel for that. But if it's anybody popular and big, you're going to see hundreds, if not thousands, of CVEs, no matter who they are. So it becomes difficult to figure out what to really buy and what to do. That M&A acquisition, let's imagine, whatever, I'm a Dell shop and I buy a company that's a Lenovo shop, or I'm a Lenovo shop and I buy a company that's Max, or I'm a Mac shop and I buy a company that's HP. It doesn't matter who the vendors are. I need to understand the real security posture of this new fleet I've inherited. I just have to.
Mhm.
Having third party tools and resources to go do exactly that is hugely valuable, because
Mhm.
it's months and months of research potentially to still even produce answers that are only kind of semi accurate.
This is uh, kind of what we've been getting to, and what Eclipsium does, in case people don't know, is we do provide that third party assurance. So in the supply chain, it's incredibly complex. The OEM of a normal Windows laptop is going to rely on 60 direct suppliers, and then 250 second tier suppliers. Just to give you an idea, we're talking about, there's all kinds of firmware, not even UEFI BIOS, but also, firmware for the NIC, for the, different peripherals, for the storage. Um, and attackers know that this supply chain is incredibly complex, despite the best efforts of everyone involved. There's very sneaky people, like the contributor to the XZ library,
Yep.
that they know that if they can get in, they can affect, um, you know do a lot of damage. And so
Hmm.
what Eclipsium can do is we can do two things. One is we can provide supply chain intelligence about what's actually going into your IT products,
Hmm.
down to the component level. So we're looking at the components, and then you can see which products use those components, and so forth. We're going to give you a risk rating for products, so that you can tell your procurement team, hey, we need to buy, if there's a laptop that a creative design person needs, you can use these vendors because they have a risk score under a certain number.
Hmm.
And then we also have the supply chain security platform, which is going to go into your environment and scan and do these assessments on your actual assets in production.
Yep.
So then we can validate, are all the components authentic? Have they been tampered with? Are there any like malicious implants in your production assets? So that's what Eclipsium does. Alan, I don't know if you wanted to chime in on the value to a CISO.
Yeah, this is huge to me, and let's be honest for a moment. I've been in this industry 25 years. I've been a CISO 5 times in companies ranging from 5 to 50,000 employees. I'm very prolific on LinkedIn. I've got a lot of followers. I'm very well known in this industry. I can get CISO jobs all kinds of places. I chose to come to Eclipsium, and I chose to come here for a reason. This is a massive gap in our security posture, period, full stop. And this is a gap that Eclipsium is addressing that I don't see being addressed this way anywhere else, full stop. It's truly that simple. I'm a huge fan of Eclipsium. Was before I walked in the door. This is some amazing stuff that's taking place. The quality of the research team at Eclipsium is bar none the best I've ever seen. These guys will find things that nobody else can find. These guys will crack open the things that were supposedly locked up so that we couldn't see what was really inside. These guys can unlock it very quickly. It's an amazing crew. It's an amazing team. It's an amazing product. It's an amazing mission, and it's the best fulfillment of that mission I've seen to date anywhere on planet Earth. So, I mean, that's why I'm here.
Very cool. um, Thanks, Alan. We do have what we call the guide to supply chain security. It's a SaaS product. There's nothing to install in your environment. You just sign up. We're giving you access basically to our backend reputation database. We've built up a reputation database of 12 million plus different components. So you can get that type of supply chain intelligence that I was talking about. If you want to sign up, it's free. You just have to fill out a form to request access, but you can find it on our website, or you just go to eclipsium.com/EAP, that's for early access program, and sign up for the guide. Okay, with that, Melissa, I'm going to hand it back to you. And did any questions come in from the audience?
We did have one. It says, how do you recommend going about incorporating supply chain intelligence into your procurement process?
Good question. I think the standard today is that the CISO intervenes with purchasing, right, and says, "Oh, not allowed to pull the trigger until we pass, until we've given a thumbs up over here." Generally speaking, that's how it's done. And then again, back to that slide we looked at today, that means we're looking at one of these external open source intelligence, credit score type things, or we're looking at security questionnaires. Maybe we have that CISO to CISO conversation. Today, that's the best we have. Having something like Eclipsium and running that check as well is a huge differentiator. But at the end of the day, the CISO has to intercept. Purchasing needs to be taught. Don't do a thing without getting the thumbs up from the CISO. We do not pull the trigger until the CISO ratifies. And it's really that simple. And it takes a while to train organizations to do that. And every single person in the purchasing department, I've even in companies where that's rigorously enforced, I've still seen things slip through the cracks. And this is why something like Eclipsium also can help come in and clean up after the fact.
Great. Thank you, Alan. So,
oh, you're on mute, Melissa.
You'd think after all these years I'd get this straight. The question that I get the most and wanted to make sure I addressed, because there were some people that joined late, is we did record this session and we are going to be making the slides available. So if you hopped on a few minutes late, we did cover that, but we will be sending out an email with links to that and also a link to our next webinar taking place on April 30th. So some exciting pieces there. I don't know, Tyson, if you wanted to give a quick little preview about what that one's about.
Sure. Yeah, I'm very excited. We're announcing a new technology. It's nothing that we can show because it's all software and stuff on the back end, but it was Eclipsium Automata, and it's our backend technology. We've added some really exciting new capabilities. Basically, what we're doing is we're taking all the tools that our security research team uses to reverse engineer binaries and find vulnerabilities in malware, and then the domain knowledge that they have, and we're encoding that and orchestrating those tools to do things like static analysis, dynamic emulation, and all of these things on the back end, so that we can, really, it's like having a security researcher look at 100% of the new binaries in your environment, millions of binaries a day in your environment 24/7. So it's pretty cool.
I don't see any additional questions. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead and thank Alan and Tyson again for a great presentation, and thank everyone who attended for spending some time with us today. And we hope to see you on the next webinar. Thanks again.
Thank y'all.